great to be here. I'd like to thank the ISO, the Student Noise Dep Brigade, and everyone else for putting us on tonight. So, obviously, this is a presidential election year, and presidential elections offer an excellent opportunity to survey the social landscape. In a year like this, coming on the heels of the breathtaking Occupy movement, the land is particularly rich. If we look at it carefully, there are paths to building stronger, more radical mass movements, but the landscape is also full of pitfalls, obstacles, and dead ends. And perhaps the biggest dead end of them all is elections. Elections tend to suck all the oxygen out of the brain. It becomes hard to think beyond talking points and the minutiae of elections. So in the media, we get endless discussion of ad campaigns, fundraising, get out the vote. The main issues of the day are, will Romney release his tax returns? Is Biden racist for saying you all? Did Paul Ryan include or not include $716 billion of Medicare cuts in his budget? These tend to be a sideshow. Now, occasionally, though, just like a broken clock is right twice a day, sometimes important issues do surface during the electoral circus. One of those came courtesy of Missouri senatorial candidate Todd Akin, his comments about abortion and legitimate rape. It brought welcome attention to the fact that his medieval perspective on women is the mainstream of the Republican Party. Yet despite the literally thousands of articles written about his comments, not one commentator has pointed out yet that as part of Obama's health care reform, he signed an executive order that endorsed the exclusion of abortion coverage from any health care package. And it prohibited the use of federal funds for abortion, except in the case of incest, rape, or threat to the woman's life. In other words, Obama and the Democrats legitimized the right's misogyny. They held the door wide open for the Republicans to try to redefine rape. Because if you argue that there should be limits to abortion rights, what you're really saying is women can't be trusted to make their own health decisions. And if they can't be trusted to make their own health decisions, well, they may lie about rape. So therefore, we need to define what is legitimate rape or not. Now, in a better world, we would have a real political process. And since it's an election year, we should be asking, what does democracy mean? We know it doesn't mean elections. It should mean that communities and people have an equal say in the social forces that affect their lives. For instance, it means having a real voice in issues about transportation. Do we prioritize cars or mass transit or walking and bicycling in the places that we live? It means having a say in what housing looks like. How are neighborhoods built? What is the role of green space? In short, do we prioritize consumption or community in our lived experience? It's about deciding how our healthcare resources are spent. Do we emphasize pills, machines, and surgery? Or do we emphasize integrated health, social well-being, nutrition, exercise for the body and mind? It's about education. Are we preparing children to be obedient corporate citizens, or is education something that everyone should have access to throughout their whole lives? Should it be about intellectual and social development and what the ancient Greeks termed the pursuit of the good life? We can run through all the aspects of our society and pose similar questions. The more questions we ask, the more we realize all these facets of our lives are integrated. You can't talk about healthcare without talking about access to green space and transportation and housing. You can't talk about education without thinking about the nature of work, or what is the role of community, or what role does culture play in our lives. From these questions, it naturally follows that we have virtually no power to affect these aspects of our lives beyond what we can purchase in the market. In the great democratic experiment that is America, or so we've been taught since childhood, there is an utter and complete lack of democracy in this land. Yet we are still trapped in this presidential election cycle, which every 4 years bombards our senses and sensibilities with the most important election ever. Why is it that every presidential election is the most important election ever? In fact, in thinking about it, I realized that our electoral process is essentially, it's like a bag of Doritos. You know, the ones that say nacho cheesier. Notice that they don't say nacho cheesy. Those Doritos are in a state of constant ontological progress, always becoming cheesier tomorrow, no matter how cheesy it is today. It's the same with presidential elections. Every election is the most important one ever, except the next one, which will be even more important 10th year. The funny thing is, few voters even back their home team. For instance, just talk to someone who supports Obama, and they won't be able to name one policy that they support that they actually understand. Most people who support Obama will immediately say health care. Well, just simply explain to them that this plan was drafted by the Heritage Foundation, one of the architects of the new right, and of course it's exactly similar to Romney Care. And what it really does, it delivers millions of people to the healthcare companies, to the pharmaceutical companies, to the insurance companies, to hospitals. It ends up taking the healthcare that we have, making it worse, and spreading it around to more people. Once you explain it to them, they'll end up mumbling something about Republicans sabotaging Obama for the last 4 years, ignoring the fact that the Democrats had a congressional supermajority for 2 of those years. As for Romney, his only appeal, other than his sinister blandness, is that he is the not Obama, just as John Kerry in 2004 was the not Bush. Now, nearly half the country is convinced that one multimillionaire in a suit is in the process of destroying America. And just about half of the rest of the country is convinced that a multimillionaire in a suit is going to destroy America. In the actual middle, what these elections are all about is really 4 to 6 million voters. That's the entire sum, essentially, of the swing voters in this country. These are the people, essentially, who haven't made their minds up after 4 years, whether they support Obama and Romney, just like the swing voters in 2004 still couldn't make their minds up whether they supported Bush. Essentially, these are the people who stand at the counter at McDonald's and stare blankly at the menu because they still haven't made up their minds whether they want a Big Mac or a Quarter Pounder. Now, this group is the focus of the bellowing herd of journalistic know-nothings and the object of attention of more than $2 billion that will be spent just on the presidential race. That works out to about $300 to $500 per voter. It would, in fact, just be a lot easier to start offering people vouchers and gift cards rather than going through this electoral circus. Now, I'm not telling anyone anything they don't know to say we have one party, the Party of Wall Street, with 2 wings. But I'm not going to say it's all Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Sure, there are some important differences. It comes down to, do you want to be ruled by a prison warden who is harsh but predictable, or do you want to be ruled by deranged sadists? That's essentially the difference between the Democrats and Republicans. So go ahead and vote for the Democrats. The point is, it's besides the point. Now, if you go into one of those old-style mechanical voting booths, I looked this up, it takes about 3 to 4 pounds of pressure to depress the lever. And that effort, that little flick of the finger, is the entire sum of energy you should spend every 4 years on the formal political process. The Democrats are a firmly right-wing party, while the Republicans are a fanatical right-wing party. We need a much more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of politics in our society, one that understands exactly how the Democrats and Republicans work in alliance to keep pushing the country further and further to the right. See, the problem is what we've had over the last 30 years or so is the Democrats take right-wing radicalism and turn it into bipartisan consensus. So the next iteration of the right becomes more and more extreme, or extremier, if you like. Now, we do know if the right does get into power, if Romney is elected, they'll nominate extreme Supreme Court justices. They will viciously attack organized labor beyond what the Obama administration is doing, and they will, of course, viciously attack reproductive rights and access to birth control. So there is an argument to be made, yes, you should just go in the voting booth. But on a whole host of other issues, it's difficult to say who is going to be worse, and that's because of the nature of partisan opposition in this country. After the Bush years, what we can really conclude about liberals, where we had a large anti-war movement at one point, and yet now we're in 6 to 7 separate wars, depending on how you're counting. Liberals don't really oppose wars, they just oppose right-wing wars. So no matter who takes office in 2013, is there anything that's going to be done about the runaway power of the finance sector? Are we going to have this economic depression addressed? And we are in a depression. It's been going on 5 years. We have a real rate of joblessness that's anywhere from 15 to 18%. In the Great Depression, it was about 25 to 30%. But after 5 years, we can only call it a depression. Both parties are going to pursue austerity policies on Social Security and Medicare. Neither party will address global warming, or in fact, they will address it. They'll make it worse. It's drill, baby, drill. That's been Obama's policies for the last 4 years. The wars will continue. The Islamophobia will continue. The targeted assassinations will continue. The police and prison industrial complex will continue. The assault on civil liberties, the spying on Americans, and on and on and on. We know that it really doesn't make a difference because liberals do not provide any sort of oppositional force to when the Democrats are in power. So what I want to focus my attention more on is the left. And I think this is an important thing to recognize because the left in this country is as fragmented, as atomized, as with all the infighting that it's capable of, it punches above its weight enormously. If we really look at the last decade or so, the most powerful social movements have come from the left. The anti-globalization movement in the late 90s, which of course came of age in Seattle in 1999, the anti-war movement, the immigrants' rights movement, of course that came from the immigrant community, but it came from left forces within the immigrant community, and of course the Occupy movement. Now these were all dramatically powerful forces in their own way, even though that the left has virtually no resources. And I got an inkling of how the left relates to the Democratic Party back in 2004. In 2004, the Republican National Convention was coming to New York City, and I was invited along with some journalists to take part in these planning meetings of all these big liberal and labor organizations about what to do. I was working with Indie Media at the time, and we were going to set up a media center. At one of these meetings, about 4 or 5 months before the Republicans came to town, all the big liberal and labor groups went around and they said how many people they were going to devote to the John Kerry's campaign. Now the National Organization of Women said that they were going to put about a few dozen. It was about 30 to 40 organizers in the field, mainly volunteer. United for Peace and Justice. That was the main anti-war group that came out of the anti-Iraq war movement. They said they were going to put about half a dozen people in the field. And then there were 2 representatives of the Central Labor Council in New York City. And New York City is the biggest labor city in the country. There's about 1 million members of organized labor alone in New York City. And the two members were just sitting there silently, and then finally one of them spoke up and just like, well, the AFL's CIO National is still deciding, but we do know that SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, is going to put about 2,500 full-time paid canvassers in the field for Kerry. This is one union. And I was just like, holy mother of God. The left cannot compete with organized labor. Now, of course, organized labor's power vis-a-vis corporations is minuscule, but the left is in a similar situation with organized labor. And it was at that moment I really realized why the Democrats want the left in their camp. They don't want them because they need their support or resources. They want the left in there to shut up. They want them in there to not be criticizing the Democrats and to be pointing out like, hey, the Democrats in many ways are not just as bad as the Republicans. They enable every single right-wing outrage that comes down the road. For instance, before Obama was elected, he said that we need to address entitlements. Larry Summers, his Treasury Secretary, wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times in October of 2008. This is right as the markets were melting down. Lehman had gone belly up. Everyone is freaking out that Wall Street and global capitalism is going to collapse. And one of the things that he said is we need to address entitlements. And I read this and I realized, this is exactly the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein talks about in her book. There's no reason that you should be talking about addressing entitlements. And all addressing entitlements is that's the Reagan-era code words for we need to end Social Security and Medicare. Now, that's what the Obama strategy has been all along, that we need to cut it. It's not that we don't have the money. Of course, we know that there is plenty of money in this country. Among the wealthiest 0.01%, they have something like $15 trillion in investable assets beyond homes. $15 trillion. If you put a wealth tax of just a few percent on that every year, you would pretty much wipe out the budget deficit. The tax rate on the top tax bracket is basically the lowest it's been in nearly a century. The corporate tax rate, whereas in the 1950s it was providing something like about 30% of the federal budget, it's now providing, depending on the year, about 7 to 10% of the federal budget. So the problem isn't that there's a lack of money, even though we hear this all the time. The problem from essentially the owning class is how do we make people pay for the follies, for the problems of the rich. Now, this is all very much the background to the social movements of the last few years. And I want to talk about the Occupy movement, but there's also a number of different Occupy movements in the last few years. Of course, we all know about the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I think the best way to understand really the Occupy Wall Street movement in terms of who it is and what it's about, it's through the stories. My partner, Michelle Fawcett, and I, we have been on the road essentially since October of 2011. We live in New York City. We were down at Zuccotti Park from the very first day, and we decided this is a remarkable moment in U.S. history, and we need to chronicle this across the country. So since then, we've driven over 20,000 miles. We've visited occupations in over 40 cities, and we've met really just a remarkable number of people across the country. Some crazy people, but mostly remarkable people. One of those is Chuck Kettering Sr. He lives in Youngstown, Ohio. Now, I had known about Youngstown. It's growing up on the East Coast. It was a big steel town. It's been devastated. So I was interested in going there. We had heard that there was an Occupy movement, and that was part of the thing that was remarkable about last October, where it was popping up. The fact that you have it in some place like Youngstown is really quite amazing. Now, we didn't know what to expect when we got there, and really nothing could have prepared it for us. One of the first things we learned when we came to Youngstown is they talk about how Youngstown is the model for Detroit. As devastated as Detroit is, Youngstown is even worse. They've seen a population loss of about 70%. They've gone from about 220,000 to something like about 65,000 since the 1950s. Even more visible is the kind of the infrastructure devastation. 45% of the city is vacant. You have industrial districts. The industrial district is basically a giant mausoleum. You have these cavernous shells that are decaying, trees growing out of the brickwork 2 stories up, just massive concrete roofs that are caving in. If you go into the residential neighborhoods, you see just all sorts of abandoned housing. One of the few industries in Youngstown that's left in the city itself is actually demolition. Back in 2006, the city quadrupled its demolition budget. So in a lot of neighborhoods you go into, it looks like essentially an alien abduction happened there. You'll see one house here, another house 5 lots over, another house down the block, and then it's nothing but empty lots because the city decided, well, we can't, we don't want to have all these empty houses here. So the one thing that they are doing is that's providing jobs is tearing down the houses, filling in the holes from the foundations, and then coming by every 3 months or so and mowing the lawns and pruning the trees. So this is what passes for an economy in Youngstown, Ohio. Now, I got to meet Chuck Kettering through his son, and when his son told me Chuck's story, I was like, okay, I got to talk to him myself. And so I called him up and ended up meeting with him, and the first words out of his mouth were, I'm the poster boy for the Rust Belt. He's a Youngstown native. He went to work in 1973 at age 19. He worked at a U.S. Steel facility, the Mahoning Valley Works. He worked in the blast furnace area, but he said they were using century-old technology. It was literally that blast furnace had been built in the 1890s. That ended up shutting down in 1979. He got another job at a U.S. Steel plant near Cleveland. That shut down in 1982. He worked some jobs, odds and ends, and finally in 1985 he landed a position with Packard Electronics, making electrical components for GM cars. He worked there for about a decade, and GM at the time, in the late 90s, ended up spinning off Delphi, and Delphi was then subsumed, Packard was then subsumed by Delphi. But at this point, the writing was already on the wall, Chuck said. The company was moving jobs overseas. It's like local operations were pressured by wages, and most operations moved south of the border, and that was because of NAFTA, courtesy of Bill Clinton. So Delphi eventually entered bankruptcy. And after a few years in bankruptcy, in 2008, Kettering and the co-workers in his union were given a one-time chance to work for GM. And they were told, you can work for the GM facility in Lordstown, and you can keep your wages, benefits, and pension. And to them, Chuck was like, this is a no-brainer. So they all took the offer. Except what they didn't bother to tell them, as soon as they got to the plant, they learned that none of their plant time counted. So what that meant was, despite nearly 25 years on the assembly line at Packard and Delphi, Kettering said, I found myself at the age of 54 starting at the bottom. I was working alongside 21-year-olds trying to keep up on the assembly line. He said, I'm proud of the fact that I've worked my whole life. In 35 years, I only ever took 3 weeks of sick leave. And he's like, but most of us who transferred weren't spring chickens, and it was hard to keep up. He kept up, but eventually the repetitive motion stress led to carpal tunnel in both hands and excruciating pain. By 2010, he was on disability. He had surgery on both wrists, and he went into did physical therapy for a year to recuperate. He went back to the plant last summer, and he said, within few weeks, I was in excruciating pain again, so he went back on disability. Meanwhile, his wife had been hired by Packard in 1979, and she worked her way into lower management. Then one day, also around 2008, she was called into the office and told that she had to retire immediately if she wanted a pension. Otherwise, she would be fired and the pension would be taken away from her. So she agreed to a forced retirement, and then a year after that, her pension was slashed in half. And they say they expect further cuts. Chuck said after the second time he went on disability, the company told him, I should be happy. I have a job. I should grin and bear it. But with these companies, it's never enough. Bitterness can set in when you're giving your all to these companies and they slap you down. It's about the dollars. And he finally said, that's why I encouraged my son to join the Occupy movement, and that's why my wife and I joined. And it was a remarkable story, because here you have kind of the classic Midwest American family. Chuck, he's this big, beefy white guy, looks like he plays football, and yet, despite experience all this devastation, through the Occupy movement, they found hope amid the despair. And that was one of the things that was really remarkable about the Occupy movement, the amount of people who found hope amid the despair in this country. Now, another place that we went to was Albuquerque, New Mexico. We went there for a very specific reason. We heard they had an unoccupied movement, and we were curious about it. Why was it an unoccupied movement? You know, we knew it had to do around issues of race, around issues of indigenous communities there, but nonetheless, we wanted to talk to folks in the movement themselves and hear from them. Now, when we got there, we met this middle-aged indigenous woman, Amalia. She was actually a little suspicious when I first encountered her, because I had written an article a few months earlier in Salon about, is the Occupy Wall Street movement too white? And one, I said, no, that's not true. There is a problem in terms of, if you look at the leadership of a lot of the Occupy movements, I argued that you really have to look, you can't make sweeping generalizations. It depends from city to city. Often in the South, it was problematic, it was very white. Some of the larger cities, it was also problematic in terms of who was in the leadership. But then again, we would get to other cities such as Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Detroit and find significant participation from the African American community. And out west, we would find in some cities significant participation from the Latino community. So she was a little suspicious of me, but nonetheless, we sat down with her and talked to her and asked her, so why unoccupied? And what Amalia explained to us, that in New Mexico, the land is still occupied. She said this isn't something that just happened 500 years ago. There are treaties that are still in effect that are still being violated. Amalia said that indigenous people literally walk around New Mexico with a copy of this treaty in their back pocket because their lands are still being illegally taken away from them, because they still have cases in court where they're trying to get back access to the land. She also told us a little bit about growing up, that when she was a child, they would see cafes with signs that said, "No dogs or Indians allowed." And this is something that affected her very deeply, obviously. Also, while she was growing up, her mother was one day picked up by the Border Patrol. Even though her mother is indigenous and obviously has a full right to be in the United States, her mother was picked up by the Border Patrol and just dumped in Mexico, even though her mother had a U.S. passport on her. So she explained that the term is deeply painful, and it made a lot of sense. So then we met with Occupy Albuquerque, and the whole origins of it is a little complex. They ended up splitting off after Occupy Albuquerque ended up deciding to change its name to Unoccupy Albuquerque. But some folks also told us, well, yes, the group did decide to change its name, but you have to understand also 90% of the group drifted away during this discussion to change their name. So we met with the Occupy Albuquerque folk, and they were clearly upset. You know, the fact that they had essentially felt that they had been forced out of the Unoccupy movement. One of the people we talked to was Tammy. She was one of the most unlikely people we would ever think we would meet in the Occupy movement. She was in her mid-50s, a real estate agent, frosted hair. We were filming the talks with them, and the whole time she was concerned about, was her makeup right and did her hair look right? But one of the first things she said, and her eyes started filling with tears, was she said, "I get it. I get white privilege, okay? I understand it." And this is something that really kind of cut them to the deep. You know, that they had come to this movement because they were looking for a way to salve their pain. You know, they saw themselves as powerless. And then they come to the movement and they find people who are legitimately telling them, well, actually, you have this power. You have this power of white privilege. And it was difficult for many people to hear. And in many ways, Tammy embodied this contradiction, because she was explaining to us that she got white privilege, she understood it. And then later in the conversations, he said, well, you know, that stuff happened 500 years ago. Get over it. Of course, as we learned from Amalia, you know, it didn't happen 500 years ago. And so we had meetings over 3 days with various members of Occupy and not Occupy, and we got to know Amalia better. Finally, on the last day, we went with her to visit some friends. She wanted to show us this place where folks were doing urban agriculture in the city of Albuquerque. And we're standing in front of a hoop house with rows of lettuce crops in a dusty lot. And Amalia just finally says to Michelle and myself, "This is my first memory of my mother." My earliest memory of my mother was as a 2-year-old sitting at the head of a row of beets as she was going up and down the line picking the beets. She started to tell us about her mother, and as we later learned, this was a story that she hadn't even really shared with her allies in the movement, people who she had known for years. She said when her mother was pregnant with her, she was number 10 of 10 children, her mother realized something was wrong, and essentially she was dying of cancer, probably from the pesticides that were sprayed on her as a farm laborer. Her folks went to a Jehovah's Witness church, and in this church, her mother had struck up a relationship with this white woman. And this is the 1950s. And the two women agreed that after Amalia's mother died, that this white woman would adopt Amalia. And this was something that both of the fathers opposed. So the two made an agreement, and when Amalia's mother died about the age of 2, the adopted parents came and took her in. The adopted dad didn't really want her. And she says, when she got there, she was malnourished. They took her to the doctor. She hadn't been fed enough. It was also, she said, something that she couldn't believe. She had all the food and toys in the world. Now, her adopted mother, when she was 5 years old, died in a car accident. But she says over time, her adopted father grew to love her, absolutely unconditionally. As part of the agreement that the two mothers had made, the family, the white couple, would stay in the town that they were in. Because at this point, she had something like a dozen siblings. Her father had remarried. And every summer, Amalia would be taken back to spend the summer with her family because she had this deep sense of guilt. So every summer, at the beginning of the summer, her father would drop her off, and Amalia said tears would be streaming down his face because he is taking her to a place of violence. Her father was alcoholic and abusive, but Amalia felt deeply guilty because she had everything she wanted in the world. And still, every summer she would go to her family, despite the fact that she knew that there was violence and abuse in this family. But she said the most difficult thing in the world was when her father came to pick her up, because when he would come to pick her up, she would be trying to walk out the door, literally walking down the sidewalk, and her siblings would be literally hanging on her limbs, screaming and crying for her not to go. And at this point, the three of us are crying. It was an incredible story. And to this day, Amalia has 13 siblings. All of them suffer from alcohol and drug abuse. 3 of them have died already from substance abuse. She says, but Amalia says this is how they deal with the pain from their childhood. They deal with the pain of growing up indigenous, growing up half Mexican, growing up as essentially child laborers in an agricultural community. It's the only way they can deal with it. And so Amalia explained, she can never get over it. It doesn't matter if it happened 500 years ago or if you think it happened 500 years ago, it's still happening today. And yet what was really remarkable was that, someone like Amalia and Chuck both found hope in the Occupy movement, that 2 of the most dissimilar people you could ever hope to meet both saw this movement as something profound, something that changed their lives and could really change the course of society. Now, in terms of the Occupy movement, I think there are a lot of positive lessons that we can take from it. First of all, what the Occupy movement did most of all was it connected political democracy to economic democracy. Really, for the first time since the 1930s, we had a movement that made class central again in this country, and it did it in a very creative way. We are the 99%. Another thing it did that was very important that people often forget when they're organizing is it bought in the non-political. Now, too often what you see is the left is constantly trying to organize the left, and it really never works, because when you have a bunch of leftists together, everyone has their ideology, everyone has their organizational affiliations. It's only by bringing in the non-political, and we've seen this time and again, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, even the Tea Party movement, you only build a mass movement by bringing in the non-political. Community. What Occupy really showed us, one of the things, is it showed us that we needed a new society, and it created that new society. And the role of the public space was absolutely vital to it. It was a reclaiming the commons with a radical democratic populism. It built community. It was also theater. Part of the thing, again, that we've tended to forget is that all protest is theater. We've just gotten used to bad theater, the theater of just marching around in circles, chanting the same old chants, hearing the same old speeches. Occupy was really, it was wonderful theater. Occupy also raised all protest boats. What it did is it made every movement that it came in contact with much more powerful. They would get much more attention. They would get much more participation. They would become a force to reckon with. That included labor, environmental issues, anti-police brutality movements. Occupy also taught that victories are important. A lot of the reasons that it gained strength was, first of all, the police attacks early on, the pepper spraying of the women 1 week into the Occupy movement, the 700 arrests on the Brooklyn Bridge, the attack that nearly killed Scott Olson, even the pepper spraying of Dorothy Rainey in Seattle. These were, in ways, victories because they showed the face of the state. But there were also other victories. The Move Your Money campaign. This is a largely symbolic victory, but nonetheless, people felt that they were having a positive effect. Better victories include the Occupy Our Homes movement, where they've actually saved families from foreclosure and built real struggles in places like San Francisco, Oakland, Minnesota, Atlanta. All these cities have strong foreclosure defense movements. And of course, labor victories. The Teamsters won a better contract than they could have expected in New York City against Sotheby's. Two different unions in Philadelphia, a cleaning workers union and a musicians union. Labor leaders say there it won a better contract because Occupy was camped out on the steps of City Hall. The longshore unions battle with the EGT. Why did EGT finally buckle under? Well, it probably had to do that there was going to be mass protests. The Occupy movement, many people also credit with helping overturn the anti-union law in Ohio. Now, we can also break down why Occupy succeeded. The slogan, "We are the 1% versus we are the 99% versus the 1%. We are the 99% is the legitimate community versus the 1% is the illegitimate community. The tactic, the mic check, that proved to be very powerful and was deployed many times against Republicans, against Obama, against Scott Walker. The target, the fact of having Occupy on the steps of Wall Street itself gave it enormous visibility and presence. The strategy, now there are two other occupations I'm going to talk about, Wisconsin and the Republic workers in Chicago. A lot of people, when they talk about Occupy Wall Street, they say the occupation is a tactic, and no, that's getting it wrong. The occupation is actually a strategy. It's the occupation itself that brought the movement into being. Having that social space, creating that community, is what brought the 99% into being. Now, that phrase was already around, but it's the occupation itself that made it real. Now, at the same time, there's all sorts of problems and drawbacks of the Occupy movement, and only someone who has their head in their sand would deny that essentially the Occupy movement has collapsed throughout much of the country at this point. One of the biggest problems is people who stuck in the Occupy movement, in the actual physical occupations. And there's some occupations that went for over 6 months. They essentially had an observation bias. They could only see their little society. And so this spring, we did another road trip across the country. And we met with a lot of people at Occupy movements that were still going. Essentially, what we found are collapsitarians in many of these movements. In other words, people who were expecting an imminent social collapse. And their role, as they saw it, was just to kind of sit there and create the new society at the Occupy camp. And social collapse was going to come in a matter of time, and it would happen either because of peak oil or global warming or a currency collapse. But it was going to happen, and then people would come and join them and realize that they had been right all along. Of course, this observation bias tends to lead you to some silly conclusions. In Youngstown, one person who was doing homesteading there and was showing us the block that they were refurbishing a house on, where about half the homes were abandoned and many of the lots were vacant. He said, he pointed around to the decay and destruction and said, all suburbs in the country are going to look like this in 5 years. I'm like, well, you've never been to Los Angeles or Seattle or Denver or New York or DC, because there are plenty of extremely wealthy suburbs in this country. In Boise, Idaho, we met with a group of occupiers there. Their occupation had ended a few months before we got there in June. And we asked, so what are you doing in terms of organizing? And one of the people literally started yelling at us. She's like, what do you mean? That's a loaded question. She's like, organizing is the old paradigm. We're creating community there. And apparently their idea of creating community was sitting around and making clay pots. In Salt Lake City, they had an occupation that it still may be going. It had been going nearly 8 months when we got there. They were telling us about knitting sweaters, about how everyone should grow their own food. And we started to push them a little and said, well, you know, could New York City really grow its own food? There's about 8 million people there. And they were like, of course you can in New York City. And it's like, really? There's no space. And we're like, okay, how about a single mother of 3 who's working multiple part-time jobs? Can she grow her own food? And one of them responded, yes, of course. You just need to have the will to do it. You know, it's a bit of a fantasy world. The whole time we were talking with these activists, this one guy kept saying to us, you know, you can make your own laundry detergent. You can make your own laundry detergent. And finally, at the end of it, we were like, okay, you know, we're curious. How do you make your own laundry detergent? So he says, like, okay, what you need to do is you need to buy a bar of soap, and then you grate it in water and boil it. And then you need to get some Arm & Hammer washing soda, and then you need to get some borax. And so we're listening to him and thinking, it's just like, okay, this guy wants to get rid of one product, and so he's going to buy 3 products to get rid of the one product. Essentially, this worldview, it is representative of white middle-class privilege. These occupiers, despite their feelings of being on the losing end of society, still have the means and social support to believe they can withdraw from society. There's a misanthropy at work here, because they're concluding we can't change society. So the strategy is how to plan for collapse that will obviously call the human herd apart from your anarcho-groupuscle. Now, Occupy also had the problem of becoming a radical-only space. Over time, people drifted away. What that meant is you were either politically radical. Often you have the maximalism. People who would be in the space would say that the goal is to immediately to start tearing down capitalism. Of course, they don't have any program or strategy to do it, but that's still the goal. Or socially radical. All of society is going to collapse. Now, the problems that the movement encountered from the beginning, but didn't become evident until over time. One was the tyranny of structurelessness, the famous essay from the 1960s. If you don't have structure, you're essentially going to create a tyrannical operating process. And the essay was one of the first, most important early documents from second wave feminism. And it was a critique of patriarchy within the New Left. Because if you don't have structure, if you have 5-hour General Assemblies every night, who's going to participate? Who has the time and energy and the cultural capital, the knowledge of how the General Assemblies work, who have the social relationships where they can actually get their ideas through? Now, also, because of the lack of structure, anyone could act in the name of Occupy, so the actions of a few could affect the whole movement. For instance, in New York City, there was a march in solidarity with Trayvon Martin. And this was a march that brought out thousands of people from the African American community. Except a few individuals who identified as occupiers kept chanting about Occupy Wall Street, and they kept trying to run to the front of the march with their banner about Occupy Wall Street. And nobody really, they were disowned by everyone in the Occupy movement, but the problem is if you don't have a structure, you don't have any sort of method of accountability and decision making. And this is one of the things that really did the Occupy movement, that really caused the Occupy movement to fall apart from within. We can talk about the police attacks, and we shouldn't minimize the effect of repression, the various entrapment plots where they got these kids essentially on terrorism, the Cleveland Five, the NATO Five in Chicago. But Occupy also couldn't deal with even basic disruptors. There's this character named Sage who was running around Occupy Wall Street, and I encountered him at the national gathering in Philadelphia. And he was obviously dealing with some mental health issues. And he was very belligerent. Sometimes he would be very lucid. Other times he wouldn't make any sense at all. And so I started asking other organizers about him. And one Middle East activist who'd been very heavily involved in the Occupy movement said, look, last December, after we were evicted at Zuccotti Park, I was in these meetings of up to 300 people, and Sage would constantly disrupt. And people would ask him not to, and he would agree, okay, I'll stop disrupting, and then he would do it again. And there was no sort of mechanism for accountability. And he said what ended up happening is he sucked all the energy out of the room. And there is this attitude within the Occupy movement, we want to have it all, but end up having nothing. But in the end, you wind up having nothing. And in fact, one thing I wrote about the Occupy National Gathering is that one of the things that is clear, but that should be clear to the Occupy movement, is there's this constant dilemma in any sort of political body, or any sort of society for that matter, and that's conflicting rights. That democracy is not about conciliation or compromise. It's actually much more about how do you negotiate conflict. The rights that always come into conflict. We see this in the political process all the time. For instance, this is what the right is very effective at. When you have people arguing for abortion rights, the right come back and says, oh, you're infringing on religious rights. And so what happens? The Democrats end up capitulating in terms of, well, we need to allow for these religious rights. You have rights in conflict. So in the case of Sage, it was his right, to be heard versus the group's right to exist. But because frankly, there are people in the movement who want everything for everyone, they did wind up with nothing because they couldn't reconcile these conflicting rights, so the vast majority of people went home. Now, there's one question that keeps coming up in the Occupy movement that I think is very important, and that's the issue of the precariat. Because there's this notion of who is the agent. A lot of people want to say everyone is the agent, the 99%. And the problem is that becomes sloganeering. By that, when we were in Salt Lake City, we were talking to them, so who's welcome in this encampment? And they were like, everyone, everyone's part of the 99%. So does that include the Minutemen militia, the racist anti-immigrant movement? And they're like, well, yes, they're part of the 99%, so they're welcome here. And we said, well, does that include neo-Nazis? And they said, well, yes, they have a right to their opinion. And what they didn't realize is just how destructive that is. In Tucson, Arizona, we were there in April, about 6 months after their movement began, and they have a pretty good movement there. But the problem was, it had been damaged from the very beginning because Minutemen and neo-Nazis showed up to some of the first encampments. And that really alienated the Latino community. And there's very strong Latino activism there. And this is a community that's also tremendously under siege. And so the people didn't realize it, just like, well, no, actually you can't have everyone. The agent is not everyone. Now, classically, in terms of left politics and political theory, the agent is labor. Now we kind of see a new take on that. It's the precariat. And I don't think we should completely dismiss it. There are some important aspects of it, but it's also problematic. Now, the precariat is those who are part-time, unemployed, what Marx would have termed, lumpen proletariat, but it also includes the proletariat. We know, from classical capitalism that there were always contingent workers. There were always people who were out of the workforce or could only be in the workforce part of the time or not able to get jobs. But nonetheless, something has fundamentally changed in that, we do not, it's rare now for people to experience in any part of their lives the factory floor. Right, this is one of the great theoretical insights of Marx, is that the capitalists would be their own undoing. Why? Because by amassing the means of production into one space, by creating these giant factories, you bring the workers into one space, and there they can potentially start to realize their power as a class. They can start to realize their solidarity with another. They can certainly see that they're the ones who are making the capitalists wealthy. They have the potential to control the means of production. They literally have their hands and fingers on all the machines. And so that's very much the contradiction at the heart of capitalism. Yet, in this day and age, how many of us are ever going to work in such a factory space? How many of these factory spaces even exist in the US anymore? I did some number crunching, and if you add up all the manufacturing, all the construction professions, even all the maintenance professions, logging, mining, everything you can think of that's remotely connected to manufacturing, it comes up to about 16 or 17 million jobs. Now, if you take a few categories like truck drivers, material movers, these are people who just, push the little forklifts around, sales clerks, prep cooks, and security guards, they outnumber all these other professions, hundreds of other professions combined. And if you then start to add in all the other contingent positions, you're talking about something like 60, 70 million Americans work in these contingent positions. Whereas all of organized labor, all unionized labor is something like about 15 or 16 million at this point. And that doesn't mean that organized labor is unimportant. Of course, it's vitally important. But the thing is, if you end up cutting off everyone else, they essentially become fertile grounds for the right. That's part of the problem with a lot of the race discourse that we found within the Occupy movement. It's not that racism is unimportant, it's vitally important. But the way that it gets talked about in a very accusatory manner, and it tends to alienate people. When we were talking about with some of the unoccupied people in Albuquerque, about the fact that, the Occupy folks had split off and they wanted to join, the response of one of them, who was an academic in fact, was, well, when they do the work, they're welcome to join us. And we thought, that's just a neoliberal solution. What you're saying to them is it becomes personal responsibility, that you have to go out and do this work on your own. You're forgetting about the issues of solidarity, about collective political struggle. And that's not to excuse, the racism, the sexism, the heterosexism of many people who come to the movement. But if you have any hope of building a mass movement, you have to do these things through collective political struggle. Now, I want to end with two what I think are very important collective political struggles of the last few years. The first is the Wisconsin uprising, which in many ways presaged the Occupy Wall Street movement. That, of course, was sparked by the budget repair bill by Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, one of the Tea Party candidates who came into power after the 2010 elections. It pretty much was going to wipe out collective bargaining for unionized employees. And you had a remarkable movement that grew up there. It started with the Graduate Student Union, was one of the key forces that got the ball rolling. It involved a walkout by high school students, and then the teachers union in Madison essentially went on an illegal wildcat strike for 4 days. And that galvanized people, not just in Wisconsin, but across the country, because for the first time in decades, literally since the 1930s, there was this feeling that labor is finally back in the streets, that labor is finally standing up to these relentless assaults, and it's not doing so through lobbying. Now, actually, the whole time these kind of illegal strikes and wildcat strikes and the occupation that spurred the occupation of the Capitol building in Wisconsin, there were AFL-CIO leaders who were telling these other unions involved in the street protests that we need to be lobbying the state senators, we need to be lobbying the Republicans. They wanted to do everything through the formal political process, and we've seen how that'll work. Now, what happened with Wisconsin, though, was that all this energy was shunted into elections. First, there was the election of the Supreme Court candidate that was won by the right-wing candidate. It looks like it was actually stolen because one clerk mysteriously found something like 20,000 votes on her computer the next day that flipped the election. But there were no protests about it. Then there were the recall elections against the state senators, and that didn't succeed. And finally, the recall election against Governor Scott Walker, which also failed. And in fact, what we now see is, despite all this energy, huge amount of energy poured into 3 various elections, that much of the movement in Wisconsin is demoralized, and in fact, it's backfired on the Democrats. Wisconsin has now become a swing state. And of course, Ryan's selection to the Republican ticket probably had something to do with the failure of the Wisconsin movement as well. Now, the thing we have to understand is Walker won because he had a vision. It was brutish, but he forged a rich-poor alliance that supports it. And I talked to one political analyst in Wisconsin. We visited there around the time of the elections, and he told me, look, Walker carried the 10 poorest counties in the state by a 13% margin in 2010. These counties used to be reliably Democratic. What the Republicans now do is they go into these rural counties and use powerful wedge issues. They say to these rural voters, do you have pensions? No. Well, you're paying for theirs, referring to public sector workers. Do you have health care? No. Well, you're paying for theirs. Do you get wage increases? No. Well, you're paying for theirs. Now, the scenario was far different 50 years ago, said this analyst. The Democrats were identified with programs like Social Security, the GI Bill, and rural electrification. People could see tangible benefits. Today they ask, is government working for us? And often the answer is no. They see government as crooked and corrupt. They figure if the government is not working for us, let's keep it as small as possible. Now, lastly, We also visited with the Republic Windows and Doors workers. This is union local electrical workers union 1110 in Chicago. In December of 2008, about 240 workers were given 3 days notice that they were being laid off. This is in violation of a federal law that mandates at least a 60-day notice with pay and benefits for those 60 days in case of a mass closure. Now, what a lot of people didn't realize then or even now is that it's a pretty radical union, UE, both the national, the international, and the local. And they had already decided, they knew something was up. Machinery was being shipped out. And so they had already decided that they needed to take some sort of dramatic action. So when they got their notice and the plant closed 3 days later, they did a sit-down strike. And they engaged in the sit-down strike for six days. Now, the strike was technically illegal, but the fact that this came on the heels of Obama's election, where everyone was, at least progressives, lefts, liberals, were excited about the possibility of a revived era of labor militancy, it generated a huge amount of attention, both nationally and worldwide. There was something like over 4,000 articles written about the workers' struggle there of 6 days. They ended up winning $1.75 million in back wages, but they were unemployed until a new company purchased the plant. Now, after they won this strike, the leaders of the union went on a national tour, and everyone was like, okay, this is going to lead to something bigger. And the thing is, they went to a lot of other union locals and were trying to inspire them, that you need to do similar strategies, despite the fact that it's illegal. And the president of UE Local 1110, Armando Robles, explained, essentially this didn't happen. And we were like, why? And he gave one example that he felt was really telling. He's like, they met with one other UE local. It was mostly white and middle class, and they were talking to them about the need to do a sit-down strike. And he said the workers there were really only concerned about doing what was legal. They were only concerned about doing anything illegal. And that, to me, is very telling, that kind of the last defenders of bourgeois legality are the workers. Now, another thing that the occupation also did is it inspired hope that we're going to get this green collar economy, because what they were making there were highly efficient windows. And they were bought by his company, Serious Materials, that's specialized in clean technology. Except that didn't happen either, because the Obama administration's stimulus contained relatively paltry funds for clean energy. Given the scale of the infrastructure that needs to be built, it would probably take trillions of dollars. They only included a few tens of billions of dollars. Now, Republic Windows and Doors, they had 240 workers when the company was bought in January of 2009. By February of 2012, they were down to 38 workers, and the company came in and said, we're going to shut down the plant for a second time. They gave them 60 days notice. But again, the workers were not ones to take things lying down, so they sat down once again, and they got an agreement that the company would stay open for 90 days. And what they intended to do this time was they were going to start a cooperative, and they were going to raise the money to buy the machines they needed to lease a factory space and open up their own worker self-managed cooperative. They engage in negotiations with the company, which is essentially, it's backed by 10 different venture capital firms, and they were trying to stonewall them. It turned out they just wanted to sell the machinery for scrap, even though the workers were the only ones who would have kept the factory functioning, would have kept the facility on the local tax roll, and would have kept employing people. Finally, after pressure, they struck an agreement with the company. And I talked to the vice president of the union yesterday, Ricky Macklin, and I happened to call him. He says, we're packing up the machines right now. We're packing them up and taking them to our new facility, and we're going to be starting the new era Windows Cooperative. Now, we also happened to visit them in May when they were going into the old Republic Windows and Doors factory to check out the machines there, to evaluate them. And while we were in there, we talked to Ricky, and one of the things he said to us, and Ricky, just this great kind of affable African-American grandfather, he just said how important work was to his sense of self, how important it is to be employed, to have a job. While we were there also, we were there with Rocio Perez, a 38-year-old mother of 3, and she was emotionally overwhelmed. It had been the first time she had been in the factory in 3 years. And for them, this wasn't just about a job. It wasn't just a commodity, a piece of capital. It brought them together as a community, and it gave them a sense of purpose. That's something that we often forget, but it's something that the Occupy movement reminded us of, that we need a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. Occupy gave people who entered it a sense of completeness, and having community motivates people far more than some sort of wonkish program about healthcare. Now, the New Era's Window Collective is no socialist utopia, but we do have an example of some workers owning some of the means of production. They'll collectively run the company. They'll decide what to manufacture, how to run the business. They'll sell the products themselves and decide what to do with the profits. Of course, there's still limits to it. They're heavily constrained by capitalism, and they also know what their competitive advantage is. Without executives to pay, they can undercut the competition. So there'll be a pressure to exploit themselves to remain competitive. Nonetheless, they are a shining example of worker self-organizing, and if successful, they can offer an alternative to predatory corporations. Before we had visited them, we had met with Staunton Lynn in Youngstown, Ohio. And Staunton and his wife Alice are a remarkable couple. They're in their 80s. Staunton was a professor. He went to North Vietnam in the 1960s and was fired for it. And in his 40s, he decided, I'm going to become a labor lawyer. So he went back to law school because labor needs good lawyers. In the late 1970s, he was involved in an effort to turn a U.S. steel facility into a cooperative. This is a whole different scale. The New Era's cooperative, they're talking about a few dozen workers. The U.S. Steel facility was actually profitable. This is a thing we need to remember about a lot of the deindustrialization. It wasn't that these industries were unprofitable. Many of them were. They were razor-thin profitability often. It's just that the capitalists realized they could make more money if they got rid of these industries and used that capital to speculate in housing and real estate and stock market and derivatives and gold, whatever. So he was involved in this effort to turn a U.S. Steel facility into a cooperative, which would have potentially employed up to 8,000 people. And they actually had support from the Carter administration, except that support vanished after midterm elections, and the company was able to dump the facility without them getting access to it. But Staunton still, told us that he had great hope, and he was a remarkable person to meet with, because even in his 80s, he was full of life, but sharp analysis. And he told us that ultimately the two most important things that any organizer, any activist can do is, one is to listen, and two is to laugh. And what he was saying is, effectively the most important thing is to build community. And I think that is one of the things that we've seen across the country in the last year, that it's those movements who build community through the political process are the ones that are going to be successful and really transform our society. Thank you.